Okay, here we are. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Welcome to class. Social psychology. It's the third week from the end. We have 2 more weeks after this week. And so today, actually, social psychology, I like to show a few videos for this week. And so today's going to be a little trickier maybe than usual. But if you figure out how to pause and restart, I think we're good. So I'm sending you on Canvas, you'll have a list of the videos that I want to show. There are the videos that are linked in the presentation, but I'm going to send you a list of them so that they're right there on your announcements. Because I can't figure out how to switch the share of my screen in a way that makes sense, I can't do it. So I'm just going to ask you, when I say, okay, now watch video number 3 or number 4, whatever it is, then pause this and watch that video and then come back, okay? And we'll look at it from there. There's a quiz that goes along with these, and these are kind of open-ended questions about the issues that we're talking about. So it's less of a multiple choice quiz as it is, what do you think about these kinds of things? Lots of interaction maybe between you and the quiz and me. Yeah, because the social distancing is a thing. All right. So that's what we're going to do this week. There's no activity because I think this is probably good enough, probably enough work for you. You had a lot to do last week. This week, let's take a little bit of a break. You have observational diary 10 due this weekend. That's your last one. No activity, so it's just this lecture, watching the videos, and doing the quiz, which is really like your own discussion about the issues that we're bringing up throughout today's presentation. So I'm hoping it's going to be a fun week for you in terms of learning about social psychology, which is always pretty fun. All right, so moving along, what is social psychology? Well, it's how people think about each other, how they relate to each other, how they influence each other. And you can see social psychology all the way from buying behavior. You know, how do you sell people things? I'm going to send you a little a chart later in the announcements that is a little description of some of the ways that you're affected when you go shopping and how people study advertising and how do I persuade you to buy my product. So there's that kind of an area all the way to some of the famous, ridiculously controversial experiments that psychology gets to be known for. You know, when you're doing something and someone goes, are you observing me? Is this an experiment? Are you just like collecting data? Is this a psychology experiment? What they're really referring to is social psychology. I mean, they're obviously not referring to how your eyeball works, right? So what they're referring to are some of the experiments with social psychology when we're looking at how do people behave in certain situations, how do they behave with certain influences. So there's all kinds of areas that social psychology covers, and it's a really interesting field. Right now, if you kind of think about it, we're living in a little bit of a social experiment. Of course, not something psychologists designed, but this whole quarantine, shutdown of everything is an amazing, amazing social experiment kind of thing where I'm sure people will be looking at this experience and examining the data for years and years and finding all kinds of interesting things. So, for example, here are some of the questions that might come up. And I'm going to ask you on the quiz to think of about a question. What is a question that might come up for you in terms of social distancing or in terms of the shutdown or whatever? Here are some examples, but I want you to think if you were going to do a study or if you were going to think about what you wish you could learn that happened during this whole shutdown, what might some of the questions be for you? So let me move myself here so I'm out of the way. Oh, I guess I can't do it that way. All right, so for example, did social distancing make life easier for introverts? Did it make maybe people who thought they were more extroverted were more comfortable with being introverts than they thought they would be? Or maybe people who thought they were introverts are missing human interaction more than they thought they would. There's that joke about how the nerds of the world wake up and there's no sports. Everyone's online. You can't go hang out with people. Everyone only is online, and they're like, it's paradise. It's paradise. So that was a funny joke. All right. So what about frequency of mask wearing? When you go to the store, if you go to the store and you see people wearing masks, does that increase your anxiety? Or do you just see, well, some people are wearing masks, some people aren't wearing masks? Maybe the people who aren't wearing masks, does that increase your anxiety? What do you think about the people who do or who don't wear masks? What assumptions do you make about them? What has helped your adjustment to the whole shutdown, and what has hurt your adjustment? How much watching news? How much online stuff that happens to you? What if you're in a place where you have really not very good access to the internet? I think, in my house, we just got fiber in, shoot, I don't even remember, but it was not very long ago. All up to, I think it was February. I think it was February. In February was when we got fiber. And before that, we had a hotspot for our house. That was it, a hotspot. And it was horrible, horrible. It's like you just couldn't really do anything at home. And everything I did with my computer, I had to hotspot with my phone. It was crazy. And so I did all my work in my office, and I would come home, and it's like you just really couldn't do very much. Things are different. And now in February, having had fiber for about a month, maybe 3 weeks, before we ended up having to shift everything online. Wow, what a difference. I can't even imagine if I didn't have fiber. What would I be doing now? Oh, awful, right? So what has helped and hurt your adjustments to the social distancing? Is it, the relationship you have with technology? Is it different now than it used to be? Do you think people are going to interact more after this? Or do you think they'll stick with interacting less? Will people be more or less comfortable? What do you think the parameters are? There are a ton of questions, tons of different questions. What do you think? So that's a question on your quiz. Think about what's a question you might have in terms of what's going on during this shutdown. This is like kind of a social psychology experiment, obviously not a real one. I mean, it's real, but obviously it wasn't designed to be a real experiment. I don't think they would have gotten it through the ethics committee ever. But it's what we're living. And so it's just the very stuff we're talking about here with social psychology. So that's kind of fun. Okay. So we influence each other. This is part of the idea with social psychology. And one of the ways we influence each other is we interpret what each other are saying or doing, or the behavior, the emotions, the thinking. It all comes through a filter to us. And part of social psychology looks at that filter and how do we interpret other people's behaviors. And so one of the things that we do when we're looking at other people is we make attributions. We attribute their behavior to certain things, or we attribute their thinking, their emotions to certain things. And so if you have a person who you think was raised wrong, like let's say it's the roommate of your worst nightmares. Like maybe you've had that roommate, maybe you haven't. And so you make these attributions. Your roommate walks in the door and you make an attribution about what they feel, what they think, what they've been doing. This is affected by your past interactions with them, but it's also affected by your past and your experiences that all came up to this point. So let's say your roommate dyes their hair purple and you're like, oh my gosh, I love that. It's such a sign of individuality, although these days maybe it's not a sign of individuality, right? Because it's fairly common. Or you think, I wish I could dye my hair. I just love that. Or you might think, oh my gosh, that's so annoying, this roommate. And then you start to make assumptions. You make assumptions about the person based on how they dyed their hair and for no other reason, really. And so you might be wrong about those assumptions. this is the beginning of potential prejudice. It's the beginning of how we interact with other. I mean, this is all about social psychology, those interactions and how we use what we think about other people to manage the way we behave with them. And so attribution theory looks at our connections with other people. One way to look at that is to watch the way that we're raised in terms of the overall culture. And so there's an overall culture of individualism here in North America, in Western Europe. It's very clearly individualism. And then there's a culture of collectivism in Asia, in Africa, in countries that are really mostly the countries that are not Western Europe and North America, much more collectivist, much more we-oriented versus I-oriented. And there are lots of ways in which you can see that when you get into looking at other cultures. And so if you're looking at movies, like maybe movies from Asia, maybe you're looking at, okay, my kids showed me an anime called Sword Art Online, SAO, okay? And then there's this anime, and it is an Asian anime translated. You can also, I think it's translated just online. You have to read the subtitles in English. Then you can also look at an anime that people made kind of making fun of that first anime called SAO Abridged. And so I couldn't find it. The particular examples I'm thinking of, because I don't remember them very well, but I do remember that when I was watching it, they would say, okay, but here, after you've seen the original, you have to see what they did to it in the abridged. And the thing that I was the most struck by was how collectivist it was in the original and how individualized it was made in the SAO abridged, because that was from America. And it's really striking to see the difference between these two cultures, how one is very collectivist, one is very we-oriented, one is very I-oriented and very individualistic. So I'm going to show you a video, or actually you're going to show yourself a video. I'm going to give you a link to look at so that you can see the difference better between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. Very interesting stuff. And then we're going to talk about the fundamental attribution error a little bit. And you'll see how this whole interpretation that we do of each other is in large, it's so much of it's about us. And it's more, is it or isn't it? I think it's more about us than it is about the other person in many, many ways. So at this point, I want you to pause the lecture, and then go over to this video and watch the video so you can see this man talk about the difference between an individualistic and a collectivist culture based on his experience. I think he grew up in Africa in a fairly collectivist culture, and then he spent some time in individualist cultures and talks about the difference. So take a look at that video and then come back here. Okay, so if you look at this little, it's not showing all the things. Okay, I made it too big. Sorry. Anyway, so you see the traits of individualistic cultures: the self-sufficiency, everyone is unique, we all have autonomy. There's, when we're looking at each other, we're looking at individuals, not groups. And you can see these traits they're very highly valued here in the United States. They're not as highly valued in other places. In other places, as you could remember from what the guy said, there are other things that are highly valued that we kind of look down on. And why do we look down on it other than culture? It's very, very interesting stuff. So when you look at individualism and collectivism, one of the things that we see is that people are more likely to overestimate the individual aspects of people's behavior and underestimate the situations when they are in an individualistic culture. So we're looking at the fundamental attribution error here, and that is how you how you explain other people's behaviors. Or their failures is one thing, their successes is another thing. Any of those things, how do you explain it? So for example, I'm saying we tend to attribute failure to something in the environment when we're explaining our own failures. Or if you're explaining your own successes, you really tend to attribute it to your own personal qualities. And so if you're late, you're like, well, I couldn't help being late. I tried my best, but traffic, nothing I could do. You're attributing it to the environment or to the situation. On the other hand, if someone else is late, then we attribute it to their own personal traits. We say it's about them. It's not about the situation. We're like, well, you're late because you're lazy, or you're late because you're careless. You had poor judgment about when you should leave your house. That's why you're late. And so what we're doing is we're saying when it's me, it's the situation. When it's you, then it's who you are. It's about you. It's not about the situation. And the error comes in because what we're saying, we're over attributing things to personal qualities when they really should be attributed more to the environment. And we're just making an error in each of those things. It's not so much about us as we think it is. It's not so much about the situation as we think it is. It's not so much about the other person as we think it is. It's probably more about the situation than we think. So being aware of this error that we tend to make is really useful. The connection between individualism and collectivism, again, is that individualistic cultures tend to do more of this fundamental attribution error than collectivist cultures. Collectivist cultures are much more likely to attribute things to the situation. So for example, they're much more likely to say, well, you were late because of traffic, instead of you were late because you're irresponsible. In a collectivist culture, less likely to do the fundamental attribution error. So one thing for you to think about is your connection to making that fundamental attribution error. What do you think? What do you think happens? Okay. So pause and write down your answers to these quiz questions as we go along. So as something comes up, you see it on the quiz, pause this and go ahead right then and just jot down your answer, right? Try to make this easy for you. All right, so in your life, we attribute behavior to core character, not to your situation. Do we do this more easily with people we don't like? Well, that's kind of an interesting thought. If you don't like somebody, aren't you more likely to attribute their behavior to their core traits, to their character, than you are to attribute it to a situation? And if you like people, then you let them off the hook more. We think of it as letting them off the hook. Oh, I'm sure it was just traffic. I'm sure she was just overwhelmed. I'm sure he was just, trying to do a nice thing, but he just didn't get it. Instead of saying, oh, they're all evil. They're horrible people, right? If we don't like them, then we're like, oh, see, look at what he did. And when people complain to you about other people, I'm sure you've had this experience. People call you up and they complain. They're like, you will never believe what she did. Blah, blah, blah. See, she is so selfish. He is such a horrible person. What they're doing is they're attributing their behavior to their bad person, to their traits, to their character. They're not attributing behavior to the situation. And so if you say, well, you also said that this person, they were raised by wolves. So maybe being raised by wolves has to do with why they don't know how to send birthday cards instead of they hate you or they're evil. You might have to fix that fundamental attribution error when you look at people you like, people you don't like, when you listen to people complain about the people they don't like and what they've done to them. Look for that fundamental attribution error. Very interesting. Another thing, do you see it on the news? On the news, when they talk about people they like, they don't make that fundamental attribution error. If they talk about people they don't like, boy, do they make that fundamental attribution error. See if you can see it on the news. It kind of makes me crazy. So I really don't watch the news. It's very annoying to me. And so I just don't do it. All right. Next thing you think about is your attitudes. So social psychology looks a lot at this idea of attitude, your point of view. How did you get your attitude? Where did it come from? What does it do? How does it affect you? How does it affect the way that you behave with other people, the way that you are influenced by other people, all of those kinds of things. And so uh, understandings of stereotyping, understandings of what prejudice is, all of those kind of fall under this larger idea of attitude. And the essential pieces are that we're shaped by the people, we're shaped by who we think we are. We're shaped by who we think other people are, based on how we interpret our experiences. And the way we interpret our experiences, in large part, came at the beginning from how our parents interpreted their experiences. And so if you look at, if your parents were the kind of parents who were always saying, oh my gosh, we can never get ahead, we're just victims of the world, people, they're always getting down on us, you can never make it, if you try, then you just get punished. You know, that's an interpretation of the world. And if you're raised by parents like that, then you tend to do those sorts of things unless you make a really solid effort to counter that and develop a different way of attributing or making meaning of your experiences. And so the questions for you right now that I want you to look at for your quiz are, if we're limited, are we limited? I mean, I think we are limited by who we think we are. So we have these ideas of who we are. Don't you think that those ideas limit you in what you do? So if I say to somebody, I'm not that kind of person. You know how we talked a few weeks ago about that more positive thinking, about that self-talk, you know, if you're like, well, I'm not a math person, and then you change it to say, I'm becoming a math person. We talked about that. You know, what if you recognize limits you've put on yourself and you say, I am not good at that? I don't know. Are you? Are you not good at it? You're limited, I think, by the assumptions you make about who you think you are. So the question for you that I want you to think about is, what assumptions do you make about yourself that limit you? What assumptions do you make? Like, I'm disorganized. Isn't that an assumption you're making that's limiting? Who says you're disorganized? You do? Or maybe, you know, your mother does? I don't know. You're disorganized. That's pretty changeable. You can create change there. Or you can decide where you need to be organized and where it doesn't matter. Like maybe your sock drawer, it doesn't matter. Maybe other places it does matter. So there are assumptions you make about yourself that are limiting. It's hard to see those, okay? Because when you're looking at yourself, it's harder to see the stuff that's going on. When you're looking at other people, that's a lot easier. So you can sit down and analyze your roommate. That's kind of fun, right? And so you can identify how your roommate gets limited by her assumptions. So what if you've got somebody in your life who says things like, oh, I could never do that. I'm not good enough to do that, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not bold enough, etc. I think they're being limited by the assumptions they make about themselves. So their attitude about themselves limits what they can do. And if they just keep believing it, then they don't do it, and they don't see that they could succeed when you start saying, this is just who I am. So think about your viewpoint. What does this mean about you? What are the things that might be limiting you that are assumptions you've just made about your personality? And maybe find somebody who knows you pretty well and ask them, because they're not limited probably by the same things that you're limited by. And they probably won't agree with you very much when you say, I don't think I could ever do that. So you might surprise yourself. All right, your physical appearance. And I don't just mean, are you beautiful or are you not beautiful? What I mean is your physical appearance in terms of your stance, your connection with everyone, the way you present yourself, all of those things affect your thoughts and your feelings. One of the things we know, and I think I mentioned this when we were in class, is that when you're standing up straight and your posture is tall and beautiful, then you actually have less cortisol happening in your body. and more testosterone. More testosterone happens because you feel confident. When you crouch down and you're like this, I don't hurt me, right? Then your body's going, oh, okay, we're in danger. Cortisol, dump the cortisol because clearly a tiger is about to eat you right now. So watch this video that has to do with physical appearance, thoughts, and feelings. Lots of interesting stuff in this video. And pause now, watch the video, and then come back. Okay, this is a picture of the maze that he was referring to at Chartres, that maze where people walk around the maze and then they're, you know, it's like that symbolic journey of life. I just thought you might want to see what it actually looks like because it's hard to get a sense of that. So here's the picture of the maze that he was talking about. All right, next item. Next item. Answer your quiz question. Next item. So I think it's interesting in social psychology to think about this idea of in-groups and out-groups. And sometimes people look at the same concept and they talk about it like your tribe, in your tribe, outside your tribe, that sort of a thing. And so there is some really interesting stuff here in this soundbite from the Ben Shapiro show. He talks about in-groups and out-groups. Now here there's no video, so I can just play it for you. What I'm looking at is from minute 7:55 to about minute 12:15. So warning here, there is some discussion, a little bit of child abuse. He's very unhappy with people who have done this. He talks about the death penalty. If this is upsetting to you and you need to skip this part, just text me and say, I skipped it because it's upsetting. That's fine, no worries. So you can just skip this whole slide if you want. But his discussion of in-group and out-group thinking, I think is so relevant to where we are today. And you think about what are the in-groups that you belong to. There's your family, there's your religion, or your political beliefs, or you know, maybe it's your sports team, or whatever groups that you find yourself having an affinity toward. Maybe you identify as, I'm someone who's a gamer. I like gaming. And so that is becoming kind of an in-group for you. And then when people insult your in-group, how do you feel? You know, if someone says, oh, gamers are all like, I don't know, they all wear lipstick. I know, that's like the goofiest thing ever. Gamers all wear lipstick. And you're like, oh, I'm offended. You know, you're more offended when it's your in-group than you are when it's your out-group. What's going on there? That's so interesting that we have this way of like taking on the in-group and being instantly defensive about anything that seems to damage the in-group. It's so much so that it's hard for us to think straight. And we can't even look at reality very well because we're taken over by the need to defend our in-group. And so my comments are, it's hard to be 100% in a group and be able to see and admit to the things that someone else did who was in the group as being bad. So let's say you're in an in-group and there's someone else who's in the group and they did some really cruddy stuff to someone. You have this like need to defend the in-group. It's really interesting how that need is, it's easy to overwhelm your ability to even say, dude, that was wrong. Yeah, I don't care if he's in my group. It was still wrong what he did. We feel an instant urge to defend unless you're really aware of that and you're really centered in you and can really be able to see that issue. But it's good to be aware of that issue of the in-group and the out-group. So let's go ahead and, you know what, I'm just gonna have you do the same thing because I wanna make sure it works. And so I know it'll work if I give you the clip. Just go to minute 7:55 and then stop at about 12:15, all right? And take a listen at Ben Shapiro's ideas about in-group and out-group. He's talking about it in the context of sexual abuse by Catholic priests, but it applies, he's applying it to other groups as well. It's very, very interesting stuff. So pause and go there. Okay. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the famous social psychology experiment by Milgram. So Stanley Milgram was a guy at Yale. And what he did was he looked at obedience, and he used electric shock to measure people's willingness to do electric shock, to measure their obedience. And very, very interesting stuff. So the thing with Milgram is a lot of what we knew about it was modified a little bit in 2015. In 2015, they discovered some old tapes and equipment in one of the storage units at Yale University that were from the original Milgram experiment, and it shed new light on what actually happened. Very, very interesting. So what we normally understood, or prior to that, what we understood had happened was Milgram ran a whole bunch of experiments, and what happened was that somebody came in and they agreed to do the experiment. They paid them in advance. And so that was like a little bit of the pressure, is you've already been paid to do this. You know, they already paid you. You got to do it. And so they were told that they were going to take the role of the teacher. And then there was going to be another person who was the learner. And so they came in and they're thinking, well, I could be either the teacher or the learner, and they're going to let me know which. And so then you open up your envelope or whatever, and you're like, oh, well, I'm the teacher. Okay. Well, they didn't know this, but all of the learners were people who were Confederates in the study. Nobody who had the experiment done was a learner. The learners were all acting. They were all actors, you could say. Confederates are actors. And so they come in and they're told, what happens is that the person is going to try and learn some things, and every time they get it wrong, like maybe a list of words or something, every time they get it wrong, you have to shock them. And if they get it wrong again, then you have to shock them more. And so you just raise the level of the shock more and more and more. Okay. And so they said, and here's a little sample of what a shock feels like. So they gave them a really low shock so that they could feel what it was like that they were doing to the other person. You know, so they kind of got a little bit of a sense of the really low level of the shock. And so they started, and the person would start teaching the person who's learning, and the person who's learning would get something wrong because, you know, they're supposed to, they're acting. And then they had to shock the person. The teacher had to shock the learner. And so there was some resistance by some of them, like, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to shock them. And the person who was running the experiment would come in and pressure them to do the shock anyway. Oh, come on. We already paid you. Come on. You know, they're not learning. You have to do it. Okay. And so what Milgram found that was shocking to America was that an astonishing number of people went ahead and shocked the learner all the way to the maximum. And so people heard about this experiment and they're like, oh, people are horrible. People are horrible, right? So that was like the idea of the Milgram experiment, that people saw lots of people were obedient to the point to where they shocked someone to the maximum. Can't even imagine. I would never do that. But then Milgram saying that over 60% of the people did it that way, like 65% maybe, went ahead and shocked people to the max. And the actors are like screaming and begging for mercy, and they shocked them anyway. And wow, doesn't that mean we're all inherently able to do this? We're all kind of evil. And boy, does that explain what happened in World War II with the Nazis. Maybe that explains some of it, right? So that's where things were with Milgram. Very interesting stuff came out of this 2015 discovery of extra information in the basement or wherever it was at Yale University where it was discovered. So one of the things we saw was that the person who was the experimenter, the person who came in and pressured the people to keep shocking the learner, this guy did all kinds of different things that were kind of off book. So there was a script. He totally did not stick to the script, completely did not. And so people would come in and they would try to say, no, I don't want to do it anymore. And he would pressure them with all kinds of different things. individually, finding the thing that made them most vulnerable to going on and continuing to shock the person. And so one of the problems that we have with the experiment then is that it's so individualized, you can't really make group assumptions, except that if you get somebody who knows all of the things about you, maybe you are much more vulnerable to going ahead and doing things that you don't want to do if somebody is pressuring you on an individual way. But they didn't stick to the script. So that's kind of a problem in terms of overall study design. Another thing that's interesting, Milgram was involved in less than half. I think maybe a third of the experiments he was involved in, and the rest were all run by his research assistant. And so the research assistant was the guy who ran most of the experiments. Another thing to think about in that time period, so this was late 60s, early 70s kind of time period. One of the things that was really popular at the time was this TV show called Candid Camera. And it was like kind of ubiquitous. And I'm old enough to remember, now I wouldn't remember it from like 1970, because I wasn't quite old enough then to remember. But I do remember when I was little, this idea of Candid Camera. And I remember with my friends, sometimes we'd see something weird and we'd be like, ooh, are we on Candid Camera? And so if you wanted to, for fun, not on your quiz, just for fun, but if you wanted to go look up on YouTube some old episodes of Candid Camera, those are really interesting. There's one about pizza boxes where the guy says, we have to reuse the pizza boxes. And the person who's buying the pizza is like, what? And anyway, it's pretty funny. So you could look that one up. There's a whole bunch of them. But you see this whole culture of not believing craziness because you think it's just been arranged so that people can look at your reaction and laugh. Which all those, I mean, there's some fun videos. You could get stuck there. And so people come into this and they look at it and they're like, there's no way this is real. And actually some of this data indicates, so what they did was they looked at every single individual and they kept individual records. And what they saw was that there were a lot of people who did not believe that the person was actually being shocked, thought it was all a fake, and they're correct. And so in some cases, I think it's between 60 and 70% of the people who were the subjects in the experiment did not believe that the person was actually being shocked. And so you got to take that into account when you see this high number of people who are willing to shock other people. How many of them were like, no, this is just totally a fake. I'm not actually shocking them. That's another kind of interesting thought to have. All right. So Milgram, his standings have been replicated, his study has been replicated enough for us to know that there really is something about persuading another person that makes them obedient, even obedient to the point to where they do things to hurt others that they would not have done otherwise. There's something going on there. But it may not be to this extent that we previously thought when we're like, oh my gosh, everybody's evil, like 65% of the population would go kill other people if they were told to. I don't know that it's quite that crazy. But if we look at it in our current shutdown here with COVID, this is kind of where it gets super interesting, because now there are some places where people are being pressured to turn in their neighbors for not social distancing. If your neighbor has a party, you're supposed to call the police and report them for having a gathering at their house. Hey, they're not social distancing. We saw more cars there and people are gathering and I'm reporting you. What do you really think of that? Is that about obedience? Is that social pressure to be obedient? Is that kind of in alignment with the Milgram study and these Milgram results, that pressure would create in other people behaviors that maybe they would not have done without that pressure? How much pressure are people getting in this shutdown? How much pressure are you getting to report others or to behave in interesting ways socially. You look at Michigan, where the governor in Michigan has decided that landscaping and gardening are not essential and are like banned. And so like you can't buy garden seeds in Michigan because gardening is not okay during this shutdown. And you think, okay, does that make sense? Is that a reasonable thing to be doing here? And at what point are we compliant because we're being pressured, like the Milgram study would suggest? And at what point can you just say, no, no? In the results of the Milgram study, we found there's a lot of people who were able to say no. Only one of the studies, there are I think 24 different studies, and only one of them had that high number of 65% that were compliant. A lot of the other ones had much lower numbers, and they had high numbers of people that just refused and said, no, I'm not going to go on. I'm not going to shock them anymore. And so you got to look at all of the data that's there, and you got to look at where do you stand in this, and how much social pressure works with you. How much do you have a need to please other people or to look compliant and obedient? And how much are you affected by other people's pressure? All very interesting questions, very relevant to social psychology. So there are some problems in the field of social psychology. Some of these big studies that seem to make a lot of waves and help people say, oh, this is truth. We found this out about people. It turns out we can't replicate all of those studies. Some of them we can, some of them we can't replicate. What does that mean? We know some of that is because of fraud. Sometimes people fake data. They make up numbers. They want to get published or whatever. Some findings, they say, well, maybe that's a lot weaker than we thought. It's still a thing, but the results that they got in that one study are a little over the top. And all the other studies show something that is weaker. Maybe that's it. Some of the findings remain stable, but the deal is this. Replication is hard to do. When you want to replicate somebody's study, it's hard for a couple reasons. First of all, it's a lot of trouble to go to replicate another study. And then a lot of times what happens is people don't care because, and you don't get published. And so that's like the biggest deterrent to replicating studies is you don't get published. But now there's this big movement that says, we need to see replication. Hey, dude, this is really important. It's a lot more important than you used to think. And it would not have shown up as important unless we saw that some of our big deal studies are not replicatable. So let's start doing some replicating, and we're going to make sure that you get published. We're going to make sure it's seen as important. So that makes it a lot easier for people to want to do it. And in this way, we can see the psychology is kind of at the forefront of fixing this. Psychology is able to see replication is a problem. Let's work on it. And so we're ahead of a lot of other disciplines that aren't doing that aren't as willing to be in the forefront to say, hey, we need to replicate this because maybe it didn't work. Maybe it's not a thing. Maybe we had a few studies that indicated it was, but it doesn't seem to be working anymore. So we want to look at that. And I think it's cool that psychologists are bold enough to go out there and say, hey, let's look at the truth here. What's happening? So good for them. All right. That's it for today. So just to review, this week you have the quiz. There's no activity. The quiz that you would do, hopefully you've already done it, going through this lecture and just pausing here and there to write down your answers. You have your last observational diary due. Observational diary number 10, then you're done. If you haven't done some of the activities or the assignments or diaries or whatever it is in the past, video work, whatever, do those, turn them in. You will still get partial credit. That can really help your grade. And then next week, we're going to talk about psychological disorders, like for real this time. We'll talk about psychological disorders. That will be fun. I'll try and find, when you were going to be in class, what I was going to do is have you all pretend to have, like, there's like a list of about 10 different disorders that you have, and then you go like have this like party and you act out your disorder and people have to guess what disorder you have. That's super fun. I can't figure out how to do that here online. I can't figure it out. So I'll come up with some different kind of activity or something you can do that will make this chapter just as fun as it used to be. If you want to have your own psychological disorder party at home, tell me about it. That would be cool. All right. Have a wonderful week. I care about you. I think about you guys. I hope the best for you. I really, really hope the best for you. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.